Today on FlyWire's Fighter Pilot Debrief, we're going to look at part 2 of the Midway Air Battle, the afternoon strike, both the Japanese and the Americans. So stick with us on FlyWire. Hi, I'm Scott Perdue, and today on FlyWire, we're going to look at the afternoon air battle at Midway, the Hiryu strike against the American carriers, and then the second strike by the Enterprise and the Hornet against the Hiryu. In part 1 of this series, we already covered the setup of the battle and the first strike that sank Kaga, Akagi, and Hiryu. That was a pivotal battle, so if you haven't seen that video, please watch it first because it plays into this one. I'm not going to go over the ground I already covered in that video. With the Hiryu still afloat, the aggressive tendencies of Nagomo and Yamaguchi, the Cardiff 2 commander, came to the fore. Shortly after the first attack and the loss of the 3 carriers, the Japanese knew that there were 3 American carriers. Despite that, what was left of the Kido Butai, 1 carrier, sailed straight towards the Americans. In the USAF fighter terminology, they had their fangs out, spoiling for a fight. And the trouble with this was they were 1 carrier against 3. An aggressive posture might net an American carrier, but it would not win the battle. The potential of losing the 4th carrier now became a very real possibility, closing with the Americans. What was unknown to both the sides was the losses the American strikers had sustained. As noted in the first video, the Hornet strike group suffered a huge loss, and the majority had not even sighted the Kido Butai. Hornet recovered 21 airplanes, all SPDs. The Enterprise lost all but 4 of their TBDs, and as well as 21 SPDs, some due to running out of gas, searching for the carrier. There's another story there. The Yorktown lost only a dozen planes, mostly TBDs. The Yorktown was in the best shape with 17 unused SPDs, dive bombers, ready to launch a second strike. 69 Wildcat fighters remained between the 3 carriers. Most of these would be needed for the cap. At 10:57, Kobayashi led 18 dive bombers and 6 Zero escorts to attack on an attack mission for the American carriers, heading for an extrapolated position. They had a snooper that guided them on. And finally, at 12:10, Kobayashi alerted Yamaguchi and bombing enemy carrier. Pretty cryptic. Nothing else. The leader of the Midway strike group earlier in the day, Tomonanga, was prepping 16 planes for another strike on the Americans with a planned launch at 12:20, without any firm idea of the American carrier locations. At 12:40, Chikuma's number 5 searcher reported 1 carrier group, and at 12:45, one of the Kobayashi dive bombers reported the enemy carriers burning. By this time, Nagomo and Yamaguchi knew there were 3 American carriers operating independently, but they only knew where one was, and that was Yorktown. At 13:30, Tomonanga launched with 10 dive bombers and 6 Zeros as escort. Of the 24 aircraft launched here with Kobayashi, at 10:57, only 6 made it back to the Hiryu, 1 Zero and 5 dive bombers. Of those, only 4 dive bombers were reusable. That's 83% loss rate, pretty severe. Side note here, the 6 Zeros escorting Kobayashi sighted 6 Enterprise SBDs on their return leg, and they jumped the flight. No SBDs were shot down, but 2 Zeros were damaged severely enough that they returned to the Hiryu. The other 4 tried to rejoin the dive bombers and were not in a position to defend them during the initial attack on Yorktown. A lack of discipline on the part of the Japanese fighters cost the dive bomber severely. Tragically, nothing was ever heard from those 6 SBD crews again. They probably ran out of gas searching for the Enterprise and were lost forever. At 11:52, the Yorktown radar operator detected the Kobayashi flight climbing to strike altitude. Way different than if they were good guys, who would have been descending. Yorktown was in the middle of swapping the cap and had 20 fighters airborne. The cap was disorganized from a hurried launch and the returning fighters descending for recovery. At this point, there were 12 F-4Fs from the Enterprise fighting 6, and 4 from Yorktown's fighting 3, and 4 from Hornets fighting 8. Unable to wait to get the various flights organized, fighters were vectored towards the Japanese in small groups. Previous experience at the Battle of Coral Sea highlighted the necessity for the Wildcat to be much higher than the attackers. In this fight, they were struggling for altitude, and the result was a piecemeal response to the Japanese dive bomber attack. Nobody had an altitude advantage. Well, the Japanese did. A side note here is that the Enterprise and the Hornet were busy landing planes from the first strike that morning and could not commit any more Wildcats to the cap. The flight lead of the fourth ship from Fighting 8 also had a bad radio, and he did not hear the vector towards the Japanese. His wingman tried to take the lead as he heard the radio call, but the flight lead refused to relinquish the lead, which was doctrine, whereupon the two wingmen split from their flight leads and raced toward Kobayashi's dive bombers, leaving the two leaders, would be 1 and 3, in orbit over the Enterprise and the Hornet. The cap controller assigned the fourth ship from Fighting 3 to a blocking position as a defense if Kobayashi turned towards the Enterprise and the Hornet. That left 12 Wildcats, basically, from the Enterprise as the only fighters to intercept Kobayashi, the first dive bombers, in that first wave. At noon, Kobayashi radioed that they were attacking the enemy carrier. Shortly afterwards, the dive bombers were about 10,000 feet and faced a head-on attack by two Wildcats slightly below them. The Wildcats, flown by Woolen and Barnes, attempted to shoot, but were too low to be effective, and they recovered to the left rear of the formation. McCuskey made a level run against the lead 9 ship, targeting the outside bomber on the left side of the formation. Flaming that bomber from close range, he cut across the formation and took a snapshot on another bomber on the right side of the formation. As he cleared the formation to the right, he saw two dive bombers in a climbing right turn, basically a 180. They were from that lead 9 ship. These bombers were likely the leader of the group, Kobayashi himself, and the first 9-ship formation was just breaking apart. McCuskey matched their turn using cutoff on the inside to close the range, and they ended up flying directly into the second 9-ship of dive bombers, and that caused the entire formation to scatter to the winds to avoid the Wildcat chasing the Japanese dive bombers. In the furball that followed, McCuskey shot at 4 different dive bombers before running out of ammunition. They just didn't carry much. The F-4F-4s. Trailing McCuskey, Gibbs and another Wildcat successfully targeted one of the spitters who had broken out of the formation. Woolen and Barnes recovered from their head-on pass and each successfully targeted a dive bomber. In a matter of seconds, the two formations of 9 dive bombers had broken, 18 total, had broken into individuals, and 4 had been shot down. At 12:02, Brassfield, on the right side of the melee, noticed a dive bomber trying to make a run at him, and he engaged it. Landing hits, and then the bomber just jettisoned its bomb, and he turned away, so he let it go. At 12:03, he noticed a 3-ship emerging from the furball and headed towards the Yorktown. As he approached the lead dive bomber, went into a sharp climbing turn, so adjusting his aim, he targeted the engine, and the airplane flamed. Then he executed a yo-yo to the left, a tight wing over, which is a tight wing over to reposition, on the second bomber in this case, and at 150 yards, he targeted the wing root, and the airplane disintegrated. The third airplane dived for a cloud to get away, but one thing the Wildcat did well was it dived. So Brassfield was able to catch the dive bomber and easily shot him down. Using his speed, he climbed back towards the furball, right into a head-on pass with another dive bomber, and when the bomber broke off, he noticed its bomb was gone, so he let it go. In less than a minute, it shot down 3 serious threats to the Yorktown. That's a plus. The Zero Escort trailed the formation and were not in position to engage in this initial attack at all. They did catch Woolen and Barnes, but the Wildcats dived away without being pursued. Another 4-ship of Wildcats trying to overtake the dive bombers were spotted by the Zeros, and one of the Zero pilots attacked the trail Wildcat from behind, only to be shot down by Bass, the other wingman of the 4-ship, which obviously the Zero driver didn't see. Only 3 Zeros and maybe 8 dive bombers with bombs were left at this point. The leader of the 4-ship, Madison, engaged a dive bomber in head-on pass, targeting his engine, and when the dive bomber pushed to avoid the bullet stream, Madison did a half roll to pull lead on the dive bomber and let his aim drag from the nose through the cockpit, destroying the aircraft, flamed another dive bomber. 5 of the dive bombers regrouped and turned southwest to attack the Yorktown from the right side. 3 of the dive bombers headed east to attack from the left. and a pincer move, hammer and anvil. Crommelin, the 2nd Division leader from the Enterprise, engaged the 5 ship of dive bombers from high. He actually had an altitude advantage. The first pass and the second pass, no result. Setting up for the third pass, Crommelin ran afoul of those Zeros. He damaged one and claimed another. And another Wildcat, flown by Dick Wright, also claimed a 0. Charging up from the south, the 4th ship of Wildcats from Hornet joined the fight, first with the Zeros, trying to dogfight the superior turning Zero. One of the Fighting 8 pilots, named Ford, quickly was outmaneuvered, and Bain, Crommelin's wingman, you can see it's just really confusing, flamed his pursuer. You can see in this confusion that it's such a fast and violent action, it's pretty hard to be accurate. There were claims on 3 Zeros in this engagement, but we know that one of these 3 actually made it back to the Hiryu. So it's tough to be accurate. No hit on them, really. Drifting to within 5 miles of the Yorktown, 2 more of the Fighting 8 4-ship attacked the dive bombers. Formanek and Groves each shot down a dive bomber, and U.S. anti-aircraft then shot down Groves. What a deal. Mealy, leading a 4-ship from Fighting 6, intercepted what remained of the dive bombers and began an attack with his wingman in the line behind him. When he was in range, he realized his gun wouldn't fire, so he got out of the way of his wingman. Unfortunately, his wingman followed him. He didn't communicate on the radio with him, so no dive bombers were shot down by this engagement. That left 7 dive bombers to face the anti-aircraft fire on the way to bomb the Yorktown. At 12:10, one of the Japanese dive bombers radioed, "And bombing enemy carrier." Remember that one. And as he pushed over in the dive from astern Yorktown, the AAA actually tore that dive bomber into 3 large pieces, but the bomb, he'd already dropped it probably, struck the Yorktown aft the number 2 elevator, killing the gun mount crew that had just shot him down. And the blast left a 11-foot hole and started a fire on the hangar deck. The second dive bomber was torn apart by AAA, and its bomb impacted the water behind the Yorktown. The third bomber released his bomb unmolested, but it also fell short of the ship in the wake. The southern group of 4 dive bombers fanned out to begin their attacks. The first 2 attackers ended up dropping their bombs in the wake, and Yorktown was doing 30 knots and trying to avoid them. And at 12:14, the 3rd dive bomber scored a hit amidship very close to the island, penetrating into the Yorktown. It exploded in the fire room and crippled 2 of the 3 boilers. The Yorktown quickly slowed to 6 knots, and the remaining dive bomber attacked from the bow, dropping his armor-piercing 250-kilogram bomb on the number 1 elevator forward of the island. Exploded deep within the ship, setting off multiple fires. The 4th dive bomber dropped a near miss close to the right side of the Yorktown. Of the 7 attackers, they scored 3 direct hits and 2 near misses. You get a little damage from near misses, water shock and fragments. The Wildcats shot down Kobayashi, who was circling just west of the Yorktown, watching the battle and then trying to report the results. Brassfield was vectored towards a dive bomber that was circling 10 miles west of Yorktown, and he discovered that it apparently was trying to strafe a ditch TBD floating in the water. He promptly shot it down for his 4th victory of the engagement. With the first American strike attempting to land at the time of the Hiryu counterstrike, the total American losses so far were 68 planes, 12 fighter, 19 dive bomber, and 37 torpedo planes. The Yorktown was dead in the water, fortunately temporarily, and the U.S. Navy damage control parties were hard at work to repair the damage, and they were excellent. Throughout the war, the damage control parties on the U.S. side were excellent. Meanwhile, the Hiryu was preparing a second strike of 10 torpedo planes and 6 Zeros for Escort with Tomonanga, and the plan was to get them ready to go at 12:45. At 13:31, the second strike finally took off, and they were about 90 miles separated from the Hiryu to the Yorktown. McCuskey left the Enterprise with 4 Wildcats to refresh the American cap over Yorktown at 13:40, followed closely by Willen and Gibbs. At 13:50, Enterprise landed 8 F-4S from the cap, and the fighter director told them to orbit at 10,000. Also at 13:40, American radar detected a snooper 45 miles south of the fleet. Worden and Hoyle were vectored south to search for him. Climbing to 14.5, they spotted the Chikuma No. 5 float plane that had been shadowing the Americans for 3.5 hours. Took 2 of them, but they finally shot him down at 14:09. There was another snooper, and they tried to shoot him down, but were unable to do that. Aboard the Yorktown, the damage control party was about to get the carrier moving again, and Jimmy Thach had 8 F-4Fs operational and ready for takeoff as soon as possible, some of them low on gas. At 1400, the Yorktown was once again underway. At 1430, the Enterprise and the Hornet were busy prepping to launch dive bombers for a strike, and there were 15 Wildcats in the cap over the 2 carriers. The fighter director sent 8 of them west to intercept what he believed to be an incoming attack. The rest remained overhead. 30 more F-4Fs were below, but they could not be launched until after the strike departed. No further help would be able to cover the Yorktown. At this time, Tomonanga, who had led that morning strike into Midway, leading this one, turned towards an American carrier steaming east at 24 knots. With no fires underway, it seemed to him that it must be a different target from the first strike. He split the flight so that 5 would attack on the left and 5 from the right. Again, the hammer and anvil, hard to defend against. At 1436, McCuskey received the command to return. Buster, you have passed them. In other words, he missed the enemy in the intermittent clouds below, and Buster is a code word used to say max power, go as fast as you can. They had missed the opportunity to attack the formation 25 miles out from Yorktown. And one possible reason is use of the term vector versus arrow. Vector was a magnetic heading and arrow was a true heading, requiring the pilot to convert it to magnetic, easy to make mistakes. McCuskey had been ordered to arrow. Woolen and Gibbs, who also did some intercept here, had been ordered to vector. After this engagement, the arrow terminology was dropped by the Navy. And also, maybe 10,000 feet, they were not in position to actually see the Tomonanga. Woolen and Gibbs found the enemy at 1438, catching Tomonanga by surprise in a long, fast dive from overhead. Woolen shot down one of the torpedo planes, only to be shot down himself by one of the escorting Zeros. Gibbs targeted one airplane, evaded a Zero for another attack, and then climbed to reattack the formation. While looking for the Japanese, he was caught by a Zero and shot down. Busy, busy, busy. That's what a furball's all about. At 1440, Thach led 8 F-4Fs off the Yorktown. The launch took 2 minutes and the last plane got off just as the torpedo attack was developing. That accounts as a scramble in my book. Just push off while you're under fire. Some of the fighters only had 30 gallons of fuel on board. Not much time. The torpedo bombers were flying about 200 knots, which is about twice as fast as the American TBD, and that made AAA a little harder to coordinate. The Japanese entered the inside of this destroyer screen, and Thach, after he took off, turned right, clearing the Yorktown. He was directly pointed at the torpedo planes. He selected a bomber and set it ablaze. The Japanese pilot stayed with his attack run and dropped his fish in a good line to hit the Yorktown. Later, Thach reported that the airplane had colorful markings, and it was very likely Tomonanga himself. Fortunately, Tomonanga's torpedo did not hit the Yorktown. Leonard, following Thach, cleared the flight deck and turned to the left toward a torpedo bomb encroaching on the carrier from that side. It happened to be directly behind the Balch, the destroyer that was sent to help, and he was part of the screen, so he pulled some cutoff to intercept the bomber and fired as he closed in with shells clattering, only empties clattering on top of the destroyer as he flashed past overhead. The pilot of that airplane jettisoned his torpedo, and then burning, he crashed short of the Yorktown. Adams launched behind Leonard and chased another torpedo bomber as it approached the Yorktown. The bomber dropped its fish ineffectively, torpedo, and Adams' bullets flamed the bomber within 50 yards of the carrier. Of the Japanese to approach in that first wave, 3 actually dropped torpedoes with no hits and only 1 survivor. The second group of 5 attacked from the northeast slightly after the first wave, and Tom Barnes, the 5th F-4F to launch on the Yorktown, he turned right towards the AAA fire being directed at the second wave, and he was targeted by 2 Escort Zeros. McCuskey, having missed the torpedo bombers on the way in, if you remember that, had turned towards the Yorktown, and at high speed he targeted one of the Zeros attacking Barnes. And he followed him up in a loop, flaming the Zero as they went. At the top of the loop, he stalled and just recovered the airplane above the water. Pretty amazing. Mel Roach, McCuskey's wingman, targeted the second Zero and flamed him, scoring pretty good. Tom Barnes attracted the attention, unfortunately, of two more Zeros who were in turn attacked by McCuskey's other two wingmen. No results either there. Meanwhile, 4 of the torpedo bombers lined up with the Yorktown, 3 dropped, and at 1443, 2 of those torpedoes hit Yorktown's port side. The holes in the side flooded 3 fire rooms and the forward generator room. Once again, the Yorktown drifted dead in the water, but this time without electricity. As the fourth ship began to exit the screen, Tootle and one of the Wildcats closed on the group only to be shot down by American AAA. George Hopper and the last F4F to get off the Yorktown cleared the flight deck about the same time as the torpedoes were dropped, and he turned towards the balch only to be intercepted by a Zero as he was accelerating and cranking up his gear. You had to do it manually, 28 turns. He crashed just off the bow of the balch and went down with his plane. At 10:44, the attack was winding down. The remaining Japanese were departing the area at sea level, and they flew directly under the Wildcats' dispatch to aid the Yorktown cap during the attack, with one exception. The Wildcats were above 17,000 feet, with one exception, and they were out of phase with the departing torpedo bombers, missing them entirely. Rawi's 3 ship took turns attacking a lone torpedo bomber and sent it crashing into the water. That was the exception. The Japanese headed back to the Hiryu with 5 torpedo bombers and 4 Zeros, as I mentioned before. They had lost 5 bombers and 2 Zeros for 2 torpedo hits on the Yorktown. The American cap had lost 4 F4Fs with 1 fatality. The Yorktown was a tough ship, and its crew would abandon ship very shortly, except for a small damage control party. And then they were off as well, and then ended up coming back later on the next morning, ended up trying to get it under tow, and things went horribly wrong there. In the end, a Japanese submarine ended the gallant career of CV-3, the Yorktown. Another story. At 14:45, Sam Adams from the Scouting 5 from the Yorktown spotted one carrier 279 degrees, 110 miles from Yorktown's 1150 position. At 14:50, the Enterprise and the Hornet launched 12 more F4Fs to replace the cap. During that launch, Spruance received Adams' words, spotting the Hiryu, so he launched the second strike. Enterprise decided to launch 25 SPDs made up of 3 different squadrons at 15:30. They also decided to delete the escort of F4Fs, launching 8 of the F4Fs to the cap at 15:25 instead. The staff aboard Enterprise forgot to inform Hornet of all these plans. They had 11 SPDs spotted for a second strike, and this turned out to be a crucial mistake, and Hornet broke the spot in order to recover the 11 SPDs that were diverted to Midway. They're on their way back, as well as 7 F4Fs and low on gas. So they needed to recover some airplanes. And when Enterprise began launching their SPDs for the second strike, they finally signaled the Hornet to launch theirs, but without escort fighters. It took another half hour for the Hornet to launch their SPDs, but they had plussed up the strike to include about 16 SPDs for this time, at that time. After the launch, Enterprise recovered 14 F4Fs that had been involved in the earlier fight over the Yorktown, and Warden from Fighting 6 had to ditch his F4F when he ran out of fuel in the traffic pattern. Yamaguchi, aboard the Hiryu, began planning a third strike on the Americans at dusk. According to their calculations, they had sunk or severely damaged 2 of the 3 American carriers, and this strike would comprise 6 dive bombers and 9 fighters. Not much power there. At 15:30, the survivors of the strike on Yorktown began to land. Of the 5 torpedo bombers that returned, only 1 was serviceable. Everybody had been shot up. At 16:20, the Enterprise strike group, plus 1 SPD that had turned back, sighted the Hiryu. Gallagher led that group to the southwest in order to have the setting sun at their backs. And it worked. Surprise was complete. At 16:58, Gallagher was at the roll-in, about at the roll-in at 19,000 feet, and he directed Shumway to lead 14 of the Yorktown SPDs to attack the battleship Haruna, and then he led his 10 scouting 6 SPDs against the Hiryu. And there were some of the bombing 6 as well. Flight deck crew aboard the Hiryu were preparing to launch a search airplane, and the second strike was due to launch in 1 hour. They didn't see anything. At 17:01, lookouts aboard the Chikuma saw the SPDs preparing to dive and began firing AAA. The Hiryu had 14 zeros in the cap. At 17:05, Gallagher pushed over. The zeros harassed the SBDs all the way down, and the first two bombs from Scouting 6 missed due to the Hiryu's wild maneuvering. Shumway, still at 19,000 feet, elected to skip the battleship and began an attack on Hiryu. It might have been a little bit early, but who knows? And concentrated on the Hiryu. Because the Shumway's SBDs got in front of Dick Best's formation of SBDs. The Zeros tried to disrupt the attack. They got one of Best's wingmen, but they didn't do it. Shumway's SBDs were likely the first hits, and then Best probably got a score as well. They were all 1,000 bombers, 1,000-pound bombs, and 4 in sequence slammed into the flight deck forward of the elevator. The forward elevator was blown off its tracks, and intense fires began on the hangar deck. 2 bombing 3 SBDs were shot down by Zeros after bomb release. But at this point, the Hiryu was doomed. The Hornet strike group arrived about 15 minutes after the attack, and the carrier was burning so fiercely that Stebbins led his 14 SBDs, 2 had turned back for mechanical. He sent them against support ships, scoring no hits, leaving the Hornet with no hits on the enemy in that whole day. About an hour later, separate formations of B-17s attacked the carrier. Sweeney led the B-17s from Midway, 2 of which did a re-attack because they had not dropped their bombs in the first run, leaving some people to believe there was 2 of those formations. Blakey led 6 B-17s from Hawaii and attacked from 3,600 feet. The Army bombers scored no hits. The Yorktown had begun abandoning ship at 14:55, and by 16:39, most of her survivors had been rescued from the water. 2 Japanese snoopers followed Fletcher's ships steaming to join the Enterprise and Hornet, and the fighter director sent multiple Wildcats to catch him, but they didn't catch him. They did, however, report the undamaged carrier's presence. 1 destroyer was left to guard the drifting Yorktown. Fearing the aggressive Japanese would seek a night engagement with their battleships, which they were trying to do, Spruance elected to retire to the east to put some distance between the combatants. He didn't want to get involved in a night engagement. Yorktown had a damage control party aboard at dawn, as I said, on the 5th, and they were getting the carrier well in hand. Actually were. It was under tow at 13:08, and the parties, they'd corrected the list, and they were repairing the damage. At 13:31, the Japanese submarine I-168 fired 4 torpedoes towards the Yorktown, and the first one tore apart the destroyer Haman, tied to her side, sank in seconds. The other 2 slammed into the right side of the Yorktown, and the 4th missed. The Yorktown and the Haman were lost. The Navy lost 80 airplanes, 19 fighters, 24 dive bombers, 37 torpedo planes. The F-4F fighter losses broke down with 6 shot down, 12 ditched due to battle damage or running out of fuel, and 1 was shoved over the side as unrepairable. The fighter pilots claimed 15 fighters, 15 dive bombers, 12 torpedo planes, 3 search planes. Actual Japanese losses due to the fighting were 11 fighters, 11 dive bombers, 5 torpedo planes, 2 search planes for 29 lost. Of course, they had lost all their carrier planes in the demise of the 4 carriers. The battle was over, and the Navy pursued various Japanese vessels to the west over the course of the next 2 days. But as far as I'm concerned, the air battle is over, and it's time to call balls and strikes. Okay. I enumerated the aircraft losses. The Japanese lost 292 total, the Americans 145. 36 of those were from Midway. To recap the casualty, Japan lost 2,500 people. The U.S. lost 307. 4 carriers, 1 cruiser, an own goal, the Chikuma, and the U.S. lost the Yorktown and the Haman. I do want to take a bigger picture of the battle and the subsequent impact on naval carrier operations, U.S. carrier operations. The biggest lesson learned from this battle concerns fighters. It's true that the A6M20 was far superior in maneuverability, acceleration, and climb than the F4F or the Dash 4, but that's not the whole story. Most of the Navy fighter pilots preferred the F4F-3, although they knew it was obsolescent. They preferred it to the 4, Dash 3 to the 4, because it was lighter and carried more rounds from machine guns. The Dash 3 had only 4 50 cal machine guns, but it carried 450 rounds per gun, which from a fighter pilot's perspective equals about 34 seconds of gun. The Dash 4 with 650s carried 240 rounds per gun, giving about 20 seconds of gun. The weight of fire is not improved a significant margin compared to the 450s of the 3. More gun time, more seconds means more time to defend yourself or prosecute bandits. The folding wings introduced on the Dash 4 added extra weight, and with no extra horsepower, the Dash 4 variant was slower out of the box. These were serious drawbacks. The benefit, and as a matter of fact, it only climbed like 500 to 1,000 feet per minute. The benefit of folding your wings is you can fit 50% more fighters into the same space. Unfortunately, the Midway carriers did not carry any additional fighters for that battle, and they each started with a standard complement of 27 F-4Fs. Weight penalties reduced the effectiveness of the Wildcat and still further, and it had armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, which is good stuff, but weight. And reduced ammunition severely limited the effectiveness of the cap. Once the fighter's out of ammunition, it's a target. It's important to note that a well-thought-out tactic executed by aggressive pilots could render a Wildcat formation the equal of a formation of Zeros, as we saw with Jimmy Thach's Thach Weave tactic during the first strike of the morning. And in the hustle to get the carrier task forces back out to sea and northeast of Midway before the Japanese got there, didn't give much time for planning and coordination. The use of radar and central fighter detection officer was a crucial lesson from the Battle of Coral Sea, and operating the Enterprise and the Hornet within sight of each other worked well in the centralized plan. However, having the Yorktown operate northeast, well away from them, posed a serious problem. The cap had to be divided, and when the Yorktown attracted the attention of Hiryu strikes, the cap was slow to react. Compounding that was the non-standard terminology and the deployments used by the fighter director. The performance of the Wildcat in climb was a severe restriction, and it was terrible, as I said. Less than 1,000 feet per minute. That's pretty bad for a fighter. My Bonanza does better than that. Extremely slow. Nevertheless, a large portion of the cap was directed to fly at 10,000 feet, which compromised the performance against the enemy. They should have been at altitude with an altitude advantage, and they didn't have that. Okay, so one of the instances they were trying to scan low for torpedo bombers and high for dive bombers, splitting the difference, and they missed the intercept on the torpedo bombers completely. And that is what the second strike on the Yorktown got through. This is a critical mistake. Wildcats had done an excellent job when they were given, but they missed intercept. That missed intercept probably allowed the torpedoing the Yorktown. The fact that the Zero Escort had made themselves non-players in that first engagement with the dive bombers was a critical part of the success of that intercept. It really was. They didn't have to worry about Zeros, and Zeros always harassed the fighters. A huge lesson learned concerning fighter cover for strikers on both sides here in the morning and the afternoon attacks was that the presence of fighter support significantly reduced the casualties of the dive bombers or torpedo bombers and allowed attackers to reach the target. People got there. Japanese AAA was marginally effective, and the American AAA was significantly better, but some strikers are going to get through. You're not going to get all of them. Fighter escort in the first strike was only a token, 6 airplanes. It's Jimmy Thach's group, with the exception of Thach's Fighting 3. It was stripped off to no effect. The losses forced Spruance to the lead fighter cover for the second strike against the Hiryu. And the reason for this lies in the dual mission of the fighters aboard the carrier. The primary purpose of the fighters was to protect the carrier from attack. Secondarily, it was to protect strikers. To do both missions in the real world of attrition maintenance and operating on an aircraft carrier simply required more airplanes and more pilots than they had. This would be an important lesson coming out of the Battle of Midway, and they would plus up the fighter complement on carriers. The Japanese pilots were skilled and determined. The speed of the Japanese torpedo bomber and the excellent torpedoes made it a formidable opponent. The American torpedo was particularly failure-prone at this juncture of the war, both the submarine and the airborne torpedo. And the TBD was obsolescent. The majority of the inventory, frankly, actually, of the TBD was lost at Midway and was never used again. And they replaced it with the Avenger. The SBD was as effective as the Japanese dive bomber, and a lesson on both sides was the relatively ineffective performance of a small bomb, 250-pound bomb, against a carrier, 500-pound bomb. The most severe life-threatening damage to a carrier requires a 1,000-pound bomb. Significant damage, and it's the carrier killer. The afternoon battle on 4 June turned out to be a slugfest. The Japanese got in the first blows and concentrated on the Yorktown. The U.S. Navy damage control parties did such excellent work that the Yorktown was operational again for the second Hiryu strike. This allowed the Enterprise and the Hornet to launch strikes that destroyed Hiryu and escape unscathed. The fateful decision of Yamaguchi, supported by Nagumo, to close on the U.S. carriers was born out of their aggressive spirit. Nagumo believed that the Hiryu would cripple the U.S. carriers, hold them, and then he would finish them off with his battleships to win the battle. This aggression blinded them to their true danger, and then they sailed right into the noose. Given the relative success of the Hiryu against the Yorktown, in my opinion, if the Akagi had survived Dick Best's attack or not received it at all, the odds are that at least one additional carrier would have been lost in the battle, if not two. The invasion of Midway was over, but if the U.S. had lost 2 carriers and the Japanese 2 carriers, the result of the Battle of Midway would have been radically different, had a radically different effect on the outcome of the war in the Pacific, and it wouldn't have changed the balance of power. As I said in part 1 of this series, it's better to be lucky than good. To truly understand war, you have to realize that luck does indeed play a role. Some of that luck is made from preparation, leadership, equipment, training, all those things. But the important measure of that luck is chance. Anytime steel begins to fly, there's an element of chance. And when you put your life on the line in combat and you lose your friend next to you, you begin to understand luck, and whether you're lucky or not. Sometimes it's hard to accept that. And these Americans were determined as well. They were unprepared, their equipment was inferior and obsolete. They were reacting to the Japanese initiative and had little time or resources to train or adapt tactics. But their fighting spirit was undiminished. And basically, that created the situation that where they were lucky and they won. The Battle of Midway was a resounding success for the Americans, and it won parity in the Pacific. With parity, the Americans now had the initiative, and they would exercise that barely 2 months later at Guadalcanal. I'm going to look at that, the air battle in that, in a future video. So I hope you liked the video. If you did, please hit like and subscribe. It looks like this right here. I'd also like to thank my Patreon supporters here. Without y'all, it would be harder to make these videos. If you'd like to support the channel, I'm going to leave a link below to the FlyWire Patreon page. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on FlyWire.